Hi, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.3 demo for the piece I call Frankie 2 Bolts. So that's right, we're finally getting to breaking down one of the two pieces I did for Halloween. So that means we're starting to compress the time gap now between the Instagram posts and what I'm actually getting done for these videos, so that's a good thing. Now, I want to talk about this piece in a certain specific way because this had a unique evolution. So we're going to talk about how it went from this rough sketch to this state where I thought that I was done with it, turns out I wasn't, to this piece right here, which is the final state of the image that I posted. So let's get right into it. So I knew that I wanted to do Frankenstein. You can see here from the head structure that I kind of knew where this was going from the beginning. Now, he fills the page way too much. He's dead center. He already fills the page. I think the final is like really a tight shot, but I wanted it to just be a portrait because at the time where I did this, I was like, okay, Halloween's coming up. I gotta get something done for Halloween. It's always fun to draw Frankenstein. Let's just do a quick Frankenstein. So I've interpreted Frankenstein similarly to this before, but this time I wanted to go with just this like crazy neck that is just like meat, and I assume somewhere in there's a couple of bones, and then this big ass jaw, and then compress all of his like major features up in his where his like eyes and nose are, just get them in this little sliver that goes across, and then stick the mouth somewhere in there. So I just knew that these shapes that I was playing with is what I wanted, and what you can see right here is I get there really quickly. Actually, there's not a lot of playing around. I did the head shape, I shrunk it and moved it up into the corner. I thought it'd be kind of cool to just push his face up into the left corner and then fill it with like neck and stuff. Of course, some of the things that I wasn't really thinking about when I was doing it is that, well, I shouldn't say I wasn't thinking about, it was just one of those things where I was blowing through it really quickly, and it wasn't something I thought of a lot, which was like, what am I going to do with all that dead space down there, which I eventually fill with like a patch and stuff like that. But and then I start by getting into the flats. You can tell that if I do something that rough and then go straight into the flats, like I'm in a rush. This is also a very green. This is like a Hulk green, so I pull it back. I mean, he already has a bit of a Hulk vibe anyways, like I won't doubt that. I mean, his hair is very similar to Hulk and he's green, but like these are also common Frankenstein things. Also, me downplaying the neck bolts so much can make it feel like Hulk, so I have no doubt that this, at a first glance, the average person might say that it kind of looks like the Hulk, which it totally does. So then we start adding in some other things to try and add a little bit to that, like, he's not well put together vibe, and that's where you'll see like the patchy sideburn come in, and he's got like a little bit of hair on his chin. But it's not crazy patchworky. In fact, something that's funny is I just recently found an old Sketchbound sketch that I did like, I don't know, like 8-9 years ago, that was like a super patchworky Frankenstein, and I actually started painting him, even though it's not at all Halloween. I was just like, whatever, it's what I'm in the mood to do. So hopefully I'll get that one done. It has like a woman's eye, and then like this big bulgy eye, and then like 3 arms and like a fat leg. He's like all over the place. So I just thought it'd be kind of a fun thing to toss around. So you can see here we added in the 5 o'clock shadow on his chin, a little bit on his neck. We've got the sort of buzzed side of his head, and we've gone ahead and put in the blush. Now, normally, as you know, I don't necessarily do that until I've done some of the AO pass and things like that, but I had the lines pretty clean, so I knew I was going to stick to that structure. So this is something that I do sometimes. You can see me already working the background. I do this for 2 reasons. One is it's good to already get the background in if I'm going to have that color influence the main illustration in any way. But the other reason is because it's nice to kind of lock down the background and then merge all of it so that I get those layers back, and I'm not spending the whole time going, oh man, am I going to have enough layers at the end? I don't want to have to flatten parts of the character. I know it's kind of like when you're budgeting money, and it's like whether I spend it now or spend it later, it comes out of the same amount of money. But there's something psychological about getting it done at this stage, or at least implying it at this stage, and then I can kind of get those layers out of the way. So now we're working on the AO pass for the character. This is just trying to capture all these soft shadows and give definition to the form. You can also see though already that these colors aren't really where the whole piece ends up, and that was something I alluded to in the beginning when I said how I take it from sketch to this version that I thought was done to the final version. While I was in the middle of working on this, I was kind of hitting that valley of despair, that whole thing where you're just like, I don't know if this is going to come together, but that happens like all the time. So while I was working on it, I was just doing my best sort of professional effort at ignoring those feelings, which is one of the harder parts, is trying to separate, is this a real valley of despair or is this just the usual bullshit that's on every piece? So at this point, I'm going in and just plugging in. I'm like, I don't know if this is interesting. He's got some good shapes, but I feel like the colors aren't really fun in any way. But I just pressed on anyways, because since all of my elements here are components, like the shadows are on their own layer, the flats are all on their own layers, I know that I have some room to recover from this later in the piece. If I have to start merging things, or if I were painting all of this together on the same layers, I would be getting into like a destructive territory where in order to fix things, I would have to put a lot more effort into them. And so at this stage, it's all about let's just go, let's just get it done. We know that the lighting direction's not going to change, we know that the AO is not going to change, but the colors and intensities of those things might change, and the flats might change. So let's just get all the guts done, and then we can always tweak it later if we have to. In a similar way, if I were to be painting in like another technique that I use where I'm just color picking, but everything is still on separate layers, it's a similar thing, but it's a little bit more arduous. And that would be like, for instance, if his skin was comprised of, let's say, 5 layers, like a darkmost layer all the way up to a lightmost layer, and all of those colors are color picked. I can still have the flexibility to adjust things, but I have to go into every individual layer and adjust them. So for instance, if I say, oh, his skin is green and I actually want it to be yellow, then I have to go through every one of those layers, determine the proper color for their value, value in terms of like the steps, because each one of those represents like dark to light. I have to take each one of those layers and determine what's the right way color-wise that I want to set this to get what I want out of a yellow skin, which of course would imply probably something where it gets a little bit warmer in the shadows, a little more towards like red, and it gets a little bit more bright yellowy in the highlights. All those colors have to be chosen. The nice thing with this technique where it's flats and shadows is I can start by just color shifting the flats, and I can say, okay, now it's yellow skin now. Shift them over to yellow skin. All those shadows should still play in the right way. The only thing would be is if I say, actually the lighting has to change, and now all those shadows have to be a different color. When Procreate 5 comes out, I'm going to do a new version of the fat pencil video. I'm going to do a new version of my general process videos, which is what all of these are, but like it's similar to the ones that I've done in the past where it's like these are 5 videos that are all about my process kind of thing. I'm going to redo several of those videos. I'm going to redo Select Paint, Select Clear. And in doing that, I'm also going to try and address these different methods that I talk about, because all of you watching, you can go through all of my videos and you can see every technique I've ever used. I do everything on this channel from something that looks a little cell shady to something that's like color picked, multiple layers, like the colors are chosen type painting. I do this type of stuff where it's like flats with modification layers. I do like heavy line driven versus non-line driven. I basically, every style that I've ever chosen on the painting side of things, not talking about like the way shapes are interpreted, but like the techniques I'm using to render, I've done all of them here on this channel. But I know sometimes it's a pain to kind of have to go through all of them, so I will do a new version where I kind of highlight the differences between all of those different techniques. So I'm waiting for Procreate 5 to be final. I'm waiting for it to get out of beta so that they don't change anything, and then my videos are out of step with the way it actually launched, and so you can look forward to that. And then that'll add more clarity when I mention like the technique I use here versus the technique I've used elsewhere. So every now and then you'll see the shadow layers turn bright. That's actually the shadow layers being turned back to normal as opposed to being set to multiply. So for a second there you see its true color. I do that when I've added new shadow layers and I need to merge them together, because if you merge them together in the multiply state, they will retain their overlap, and I don't want the overlap. I just want them all to be one unified layer. So I will flip them all to normal, merge them, and then flip them back to multiply. At this point, we've moved out of the ambient occlusion phase and we're moving into the direct shadow phase, coming off of the main light in the image. You can see that because it's harder in most areas, and it's a direct translation of like the collar hitting his skin and his jaw casting down onto his neck and things like that. I'm using the select paint, select clear method, which is where I am using one unified shadow layer on top. I am selecting the bottommost layer. I am on that unified shadow layer, painting in the shadows I want, and then I move up to the next flat and I select it and I clear from that shadow layer so that I'm cleaning up that shadow layer as I go. It's a way to section out each individual area, and it's also a way to avoid the overlap problem by clearing away what I'm now working on. There's a link to that down below if you want to see it done in a very rudimentary way. As I said, I'm going to redo that video with Procreate 5's launch anyhow, but that way you know exactly what I'm talking about there. You can see me mimicking what happens when a shadow gets a little bit of a fill light on that bolt. You can see how the bolt in his neck is casting a shadow, but then the shadow kind of empties as it gets towards the end, and that's not necessarily the most accurate realistic lighting, but it's a way to sort of trick the brain into understanding that there's like an aspect of a fill light there that is diminishing that cast shadow as it casts off. Now that we've got that direct shadow done, we can start evaluating the color. You see me color shifting a bunch of stuff here to try and get a little bit more interesting. The whole image was very cool overall. It's a cool green for his skin, the purple in the background, the shirt was like a bluish gray. So now we're getting the shirt a little bit more of a brown, sliding it towards red purple, getting that collar that's flipped back yellow, getting the patch to be red, but then leaving some cool down there so that we keep the scheme alive. And now I'm just doing a bunch of little shifts here and there, added some dirt, and then now we move into the shine on his skin, and then we'll also add things like some dots across his skin just to drive home that kind of like spotted skin zombie sort of flesh thing going on. That's probably a little bit to drive the theme home, but also to continue to pull him a little bit away from the Hulk vibe. I believe the highlight for this was done with yellow, a bit of a yellow-green, but mostly on the side of yellow, set to overlay with its opacity adjusted. That way I knew that when I would adjust the flat, it would also react to the underlying color similarly to the way the shadow did. That was just in order to maintain some flexibility there. All these layers that you see flipping on and off is usually me just trying to get some visual clarity. You can see that I added some more stubble where like underneath his cheekbone, going down into where that sideburn is, almost like it's been badly shaved away there. And we're driving home the 5 o'clock shadow a little bit more strongly now, across the whole lower half of his face. Now here are those spots I was talking about. These are like with like a green with a lowered opacity. And now I'll put the hot edge that's sort of like subsurface scattering, but not really, going around the shadow there from the direct light. And you see me adjusting its opacity a little bit. Eventually I'll select the shadow and delete all of that away. Okay, now we go into the highlight, and we add just a little bit of extra interior highlight in there. It's a little shinier, just to give it kind of a stylistic quality and try to accentuate the hot spots within there. And then on the face, certain elements accent the geometry that's there. This will all get adjusted further when we go into sort of the second phase of this painting, the phase where I'm reevaluating everything and determining what I can do to save the piece, basically. Okay, and now we're going to do the rim light, which I'm just doing because he's going to darken into that distance, and I want to get some of that form a little bit better illustrated. And so I'm adding this rim light to help with that. Although this is probably the phase where I'm starting to become very unhappy with the way the entire image turned out. I think that I rendered it more or less fine, and I think that there's some interesting decisions taken that makes it interesting as an image, but then when I saved it out and stared at it for a day or two, I fell out of love with it very quickly. So that's something I do, I think I've mentioned in previous videos, is when I'm done with a piece, because you know I've got an iPhone and this is an iPad and everything is iCloud, so it's like as soon as I save it down, I walk away from the iPad and I do whatever I need to do with my life, and eventually it just ends up on my phone. And so then I stare at it, and then I close it, and then I do something else, and then I open it again. And I do that usually for about a day before I fully decide whether or not I like the way something turned out. And that's a good way for me to sort of check my work, and if I still am excited about it after about a day, then I think it's okay to post. It kind of depends on the piece, but it's usually about a day of it just sort of being around and me taking a look at it and noticing like, oh, I didn't finish that, or oh, that could be better, or whatever it is. And then I eventually say, okay, this is okay, let's post this. So here I'm just assigning it in the bottom left, which is usually the last thing I do. In this case, I do the blur trick that I've done before, at least I'm pretty sure I do, which is a trick where I copy the entire image, I blur it, I mask it all out, and then I use like a scratchy brush or something to try and scratch away some of the to re-bring in the blur, and it adds this sort of painterly, scratchy vibe to the entire thing. You can see that in some spots, like on his big neck tendon there, you can see a little bit of it where it's crossing over into the shadow. But really, that's not the interesting part of this phase. The interesting part of this phase is how much I'm disliking it. So right here, this is the final version of the image as it was at that time. I think there's some interesting things happening, but it just felt like this big block of green and then this big block of brown, and it didn't really interest me anymore. So I started going into, like, can I save this phase? Which is what we're about to go into. Let's get some close-ups on it though, just so you can see the state that it was in at that point. You can see on the cast shadow, you can see some of the scratchy, painty stuff here or there. So let's see the steps I took to try and save this now. First thing I do when I'm trying to save something is I start turning everything off, which is what you see me doing right there. I start turning off all the shadow layers and saying, what can I start doing at the most basic point of this? So you can see here I start pushing the collar forward and the neck back with some shadow, and then I start adding in some skin variation to try and get some of this big green like just reduced. He is technically like an undead thing, so let's bring in some like almost like more rotting elements, but bring it in from a color perspective instead of these dots that are more or less just darker. Then I get the idea of bringing lines back in, because when I was flipping the line layer on and off, I kind of liked the vibe of it. So we go in and we start adding in all of these graphic details, just bringing in line art back into the render. Now, I've used line art in renders many, many times, but I usually have that as like the idea going in, and this is kind of interesting to use it almost as a way for me to save my interest in the drawing. Now, since I've brought that graphic element in, this sort of soft, non-committal rim light wasn't really working for me anymore either, so I wanted to bring some more graphic elements in with the rim light. So I used the same brush, which by the way is the fat pencil. It's the same thing that I used to do the sketches, and it's the same thing I used to do all my line art, like in my Village Corrupted pieces and other things like that. It's the same thing I used in the last video for the Gray Fox piece, Mr. Jaeger. So now I'm using that same one to do the rim light because I want to have some consistency in the idea of it's almost like saying that like this whole thing was like airbrushed and then I went in with a pencil, a colored pencil or like a white pencil afterwards and added all of this. The last thing you'll see me do with the rim light here is I'll actually select it, and then on a layer underneath I'll fill it orange. I think I actually fill it like purple first and then change it to orange, and then I'll slightly erase away from the white one so that it gives this feeling that the white is the hot part of the light hitting his skin, and then it's an orange light so it fades away orange. Again, I think I start with purple because that's the color that I'm using in the background, but that will also all change eventually. Here we're just doing all these little detaily hairs, so it looks like very little is changing, but it's because I'm going in and trying to get all of those. Now we move to his head hairs. And then you can see there's the purple, and then I switch to orange, and then we will come back to the background eventually and make that like actually red with a little bit of orange in it, a little orange red. Okay, now I'm flipping layers back on. I'm flipping on layers like my bounce layers and trying to see if those are all sound still. Do they still work with the new look? I switch the blush kind of underneath his ear and his nose to a purple, but that actually gets shifted back. That's the wrong direction that I really want to take this, but I was just trying to find something interesting there. I slap a texture that I've used forever of this like yellowy damaged paper texture over the whole thing to give it texture and to give it some interest. I changed the background to more of a red, so now that rim light is working a little bit better with the orange. There I just shifted the blush back on the red side of things. It's still a little purple, but not too bad. And now I'm starting to see that we've got success on our hands as far as me being happy again. And I have to continue with this theme across the piece, so I make sure that around like the bolt there's those lines like it's put into his skin. We're going to move into his shirt and other elements like that just to bring these lines in so that it's consistent as possible across the piece. And now we'll start on the planning for the tattoos. I just thought this would be fun to give him a bunch of tattoos, and so I thought let's make them as referential as possible to things related to Frankenstein. So that's where we go with the Mary tattoo, of course, Mary Shelley, the writer of the book, and then we got this nice little filigree kind of font happening here, and then we also put a pitchfork underneath his eye, of course symbolic of the villagers and coming to kill him, and they've all got pitchforks, just that classic image. I put a hook up here, little thing around his bolt where you would hook him up to charge him with lightning, and done in sort of like a American traditional font, like a sailory font. Then I put this stitching here because I thought it would be kind of funny to reference that he's got like tattoos of stitching, but he doesn't actually have stitching. And then I eventually get rid of it because it's not the greatest idea, but I have a better idea later. We put a I Love Lightning heart on his neck because he does, of course. Here's a quick little nod to Boris Karloff. These are his real initials, William Henry Pratt. And then we move on to the neck. I completely changed the tattoo to these big hands grabbing his neck like they're choking him, as sort of like a backwards reference to him strangling Elizabeth to death, which is sort of like a big moment in the original book. And so now we, of course, turn on all of our layers and get the lighting playing with the tattoos and all the texture. We just quickly paint in the veins a little bit. I just painted them solid purple and then lowered their opacity. And all the following things that happen here are just little tweaks to adjust aspects like color balance or something like that. And this is a great example of why everything is left separately, so that I can tweak all of these little things and make sure that it harmonizes correctly. That flipping it on and off there at the end was me just double checking everything. And now we have the final version of the image. That's it right here. I think that it's pretty radically different in at least the ways that I care about. Like, it's a much more interesting image than it was before. Here is the way it was before. The changes, it's very monochromatic and very simplistic, nothing really interesting happening. And then this is the new version. It just has a spiciness to it. It's a little bit more fun to look at, and there's more things to even like sort of comb through and find interesting in there. And that's it. I want to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Leave me a comment too. I love reading comments. It'd be super cool of you to leave me a comment. So the next one is also Halloween themed, so look forward to that in December, a Halloween themed thing, because why not? And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.